I'm so glad I'm living, everything is alright. I got a loving baby to come home to every night. Ain't that fine? Ain't that fine? Ain't that fine? 'Cause she's mine. Ain't that fine? If money did my talking, I couldn't breathe a sigh. My baby's love is one thing, even money can't buy. Ain't that fine? I wanna tell you that's fine. That's divine, 'cause she's mine. Ain't that fine? She's a tall, tandy model, a bundle of charms, but my baby beastie model, 'cause she's got a pair of arms. Ain't that fine? Don't you know that's fine? Ain't that fine? 'Cause she's mine. Ain't that fine? The high cost of living does not bother me, as long as my baby's love is tax-free. Ain't that fine? I want to tell you that's fine. Ain't that fine? 'Cause she's mine. Ain't that fine? Just grab your hand, start with a there's Hey Judy, gin fizz glow, cocktail shorty and old Judy Joe. I'm telling you, it's the garden's place in town. If you don't have your rubber, take it down. The guy bound to get a and when you ride back home, say you're screaming at the house.
Good evening. welcome to you all. My name is Tracy Metz. I have the honor to be the director of the John Adams Institute. I would like to say a very special word of welcome this evening, not only to our guest of honor, Professor Robert Putnam from Harvard, but also to not one, but two ministers of our cabinet. Lodewijk Asscher, who will join us later in the conversation and also give an address of his own, and to Minister Jet Bussemaker, Minister of Education and Culture. This is a first for the John Adams. Thank you. And also, of course, a great word of thanks to the University of Amsterdam for offering us hospitality in this wonderful venue. The perk of being the director of the John Adams is that I get to meet all those wonderful people that I've always wanted to meet, the best and the brightest of American culture. And ever since Bowling Alone, and also ever since my own fellowship at Harvard in 2006-2007, I have desperately wanted to meet Bob Putnam in person. And this evening, that finally happened. And I'm really so glad that this job gives me the opportunity to meet people of your intellectual caliber and to welcome you into our midst. And as you can see by the number of people here this evening, I'm not the only one who feels very privileged to have you here to address us. As you mentioned in one of the interviews that was published with you recently in the Dutch media, there is not a single president's candidate who has not sought Professor Putnam's advice and wise words. He was also one of the people who was featured in the book that our moderator of this evening, Casper Thomas, brought together, an anthology called The 20 Books That Have Changed Our Way of Thinking, which of course is a tremendous compliment, and Professor Putnam's book, his previous book, Bowling Alone, is one of those. Casper is our moderator this evening. I'm thrilled that he's here to give an introduction and also to lead the conversation. He also had an interview with Professor Putnam in the magazine where he works, the Groene Amsterdammer, which is also here for you to take with you on your way out. The link is also on our site if you'd like to see it. His introduction will also be on our site tomorrow if you'd like to reread it. The John Adams is the independent podium for American culture in the Netherlands. And I emphasize the word independent because it's important to realize that we have no subsidy and we are not the cultural arm of the American government, which many people think. Although the embassy does support us with regular grants, as long as our program meshes with policy priorities at the embassy. That's a happy collaboration, but the John Adams is independent. And that means that we try to keep our tickets affordable for a large audience, and we can only do that thanks to your support. We are dependent on the support of you as private individuals and you also as businesses. So I would like to encourage you to become a member or to become a sponsor of the John Adams, and I'd be happy to tell you more about that later. We also have a number of our board members with us this evening who I'd like to introduce to you briefly. They can also tell you more about who we are and what we do and how we do it. Martine Bijkerk. Martine? Yeah. And Karine van der Laan is also on our board. Yeah. And David Vermeijs as well. Okay. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our program this evening is as follows. I will now give the floor to our moderator, Casper Thomas. He will then introduce the Minister of Social Affairs, Lodewijk Asscher, who will give a brief talk. And then the floor will be for our guest, Bob Putnam. Then there will be a moderated conversation between Casper and Professor Putnam at some point at Casper's discretion. Then Mr. Asscher will be invited to join. And then there will be conversations from all of you. After that, I will come back briefly to tell you something about our upcoming program. And then we will have book signing. Thank you very much for being here at this really very special event. Casper.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. and indeed a very warm welcome to what surely is a very special event here tonight at the John Adams Institute. Not only do we have eminent speakers, but the discussion tonight will be drawn straight into the heart of national politics. Indeed, my name is Casper Thomas. I'm an editor at the Groene Amsterdammer and your host for this evening. Now, there are a few academics in the world who command such public attention and global attention as tonight's speaker. When Robert Putnam speaks, the world listens carefully. And with good reason. As societies move forward, Robert Putnam draws our attention to what we may lose if we're not careful. In the early 2000s, communities all over the world were in the grasp of a public debate about social capital. The fact that I can use this term and that possibly you all know what sort of this word social capital means is thanks to Mr. Putnam. His groundbreaking work, Bowling Alone, drew our attention to the fact that although we are richer than ever before, the ties that bind society might loosen at the same time. Now, Mr. Putnam confronts us with an American dream that lies in shatters. His latest book, and the focus of tonight's discussion, is titled Our Kids. It shows that the United States, for many, is anything but the land of opportunity. In fact, two Americas have emerged, as Mr. Putnam shows. One of haves and one of have-nots. And this gap in opportunities affects especially children. Those who grow up in a world of the haves possess more of everything: a stimulating home environment, good schooling, the opportunity to partake in clubs and societies. And those who are unfortunate enough to be born on the wrong side of the tracks basically lack all that, severely limiting the possibilities to escape the conditions they were born in. And now this topic, which Mr. Putnam will talk about tonight, is a very timely topic, as you all know. We live in an age of growing inequality in all spheres of life. This is worrying, but recently we've also seemed to enter a time of increasing concern about inequality. The Great Gap is an issue that is actually increasingly becoming a priority issue in political agendas all over the world. And the work of Mr. Putnam, amongst others, is the driver of this. And he does so by shifting focus. His story is not about some anonymous top 1%, but about real lives at the percentiles at the bottom. When we spoke earlier, I interviewed Mr. Putnam for my magazine, the Groene Amsterdammer. He admitted to something he was slightly reluctant to say, because he said, out of fear for sounding immodest. Tracy already mentioned it, there is no US presidential candidate that does not want to pick Mr. Putnam's brain. And as the presence of Lodewijk Asscher, Minister for Social Affairs and Employment, that testifies, the demand for Mr. Putnam's analyses and solutions also affects the Netherlands. So I'm especially happy to be able to welcome here tonight because this American dream that he writes about is not a dream that guides just the United States. The conviction that social mobility is important and that everyone should have a fair chance of improving one's life is deeply, deeply rooted in Europe as well. But it is often said that Europe trails the United States with a lag of maybe 10 years. True or not, this is at least something to consider carefully. Is the opportunity gap between two classes of children something that this country is also heading towards? That's a question we will tonight discuss with Mr. Putnam and the Minister. Mr. Putnam's work is grounded in rich data sets, which are a point of continuing further investigation both inside and outside academia. He also has a unique talent of picking a cogent image and using it as a vehicle to tell a story about society as a whole. Mr. Putnam's earlier classic rested on the powerful mental picture of a man alone on the bowling alley and another one right next to him. They could have played in a league together. Instead, indeed, they were bowling alone. For Our Kids, he tracked the lives of his high school contemporaries. Now, this is a smart way of capturing social change. It's also the reason why people attend or maybe avoid high school reunions. Record children when young and hopeful, fast forward a few decades, and see what has become of them. And comparing them to today's children immediately reveals the stark contrast in opportunities available to them and to different generations. There is, I think, a recurring theme in Mr. Putnam's work that draws the crowds that are assembled here tonight. His inquiry into changing social patterns in the United States shows that society's achievements are never permanent. Look the other way, and the good things that we have achieved can easily disappear. When we spoke earlier, Mr. Putnam said, and that makes him much more than just an academic. He said, "I want to change America." We will hear from him shortly how and especially also why. Before that, I'd like to give the floor to our Minister Lodewijk Asscher, Minister of Social Affairs and Employment, for a brief introduction to Mr. Putnam's talk. Thank you.
Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, what was the highlight of your day? I'd like you to give that some thought. I can tell you what was mine. It was sitting at a dinner table with my wife and kids, talking about school, talking about classmates, the everyday matters. Perhaps trivial to you, but very important to me. It is a precious moment in a day when you're just not worrying about the past or about the future, when family bonding makes you forget for one moment the real bleakness of today, the horrendous attacks in Paris that, of course, made out a big part of my day's work. It is a moment, such a family dinner, when you're really living in the now. Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, which is a brilliant book, made me realize again what sheer luxury this is. By enjoying the present, I'm securing the future of my kids. With every shared meal, I'm feeding them with opportunity. And that's indeed food for thought. Opportunity as a special treat, a luxury item that maybe not everyone can afford anymore. In his book, Mr. Putnam shows us how daily concerns prevent lower educated people from securing a decent future for themselves and for their kids. Not only are they unable to enjoy the now, they're stuck in it, with little time for shared meals. It's an aspect of a gloomy story unfolding in the United States right now, very eloquently described by Mr. Putnam. He shows us how industrialization has led to social change and how America has become increasingly divided. On the good side of the track, rich kids live in gated communities and go to private schools. On the other side, you see poor kids living in dilapidated districts, attending rundown schools. Yet, Putnam's Tale of Two Americas is not only about being born on the right or wrong side of the tracks. It is about the fact that the underpasses for a better life are being barricaded one by one. Opportunity has become a luxury item. Therefore, the American dream is at risk. This has led to disillusionment and despair. I was startled when I heard about a study by Deaton and Case showing how the downward trend in the American mortality rate has reversed since 1998. While in other rich countries the mortality rates continue to decline by 2% a year, that of American white males rose by 0.5% a year. No other rich country saw a similar turnaround. In a recent interview, Mr. Deaton suggests that middle-aged whites have lost the narrative of their lives. They were raised with a dream, but woke up in a nightmare. How does this American tale of broken dreams translate to our country, to the Netherlands? Can we simply copy-paste the content of Putnam's book to the Dutch situation, or is our story a different one? And if we look into the crystal ball, how bright is the future for our kids? Will poor kids be able to use an underpass to a better life in this country? The Dutch story of wealth and opportunity is quite different from that of the United States. We don't speak about rags or riches here, but about dimes and quarters. If you're born as a dime, you won't end up as a quarter. Or at least that's how the old saying goes. And perhaps that was the case when this saying was coined. Yet, our collective efforts in building a welfare state after World War II have made the proverb obsolete. Regardless of your background, everyone has access to basic services and provisions, good public education, child support, welfare, minimum wage jobs, affordable public housing and healthcare. These services are not just the basics of life, but also the basics of opportunity for everyone. So far, our tale has not been one of separate worlds. And as you can see on the screen, the Netherlands has much better social outcomes than the United States. On almost every indicator, child poverty, teenage birth, the proportion of children living with sole parents, the Netherlands scores better. This translates into better outcomes in terms of education and work. Dutch children score higher than US children in the PISA education tests, and are half as likely not to be in education, employment or training. I think these numbers show that investing in children and their circumstances pays off. Dutch children are fed with more opportunity, and hence their future prospects are better. So this would be a perfect moment to end this talk and give over to Mr. Putnam, but in all honesty, that would be too easy. I don't think it's time to say so far so good and may we live happily ever after. Not quite. Because globalization and new technological advances, like the robots, have started to erode job security and income for some groups in the Dutch and international labor markets. And like the American dream, our welfare state is now at risk. And so is social mobility. Of course, these trends of globalization and technological advances have a positive side, but they do also have a negative side, one in which the value of work may be affected, where flexibility has run out of control, where people have 4 jobs but no prospect of a future. And as a consequence, the social divide between poor and rich is increasing. Not yet to the same extent as in the United States, but it's still a worrying development. A recent report by the Netherlands Institute for Social Research has identified 2 large vulnerable groups in the Netherlands: workers with an uncertain future and the precariat. Together they comprise 1/3 of the Dutch population. These groups have less economic, cultural and social capital than the rest of the population. And the report states that dealing with the joint problems of structural inequality is an urgent task for policymakers, especially now the social divide is still bridgeable. I cannot agree more. Now it's not just the lower class, but it's the middle class that's at risk. People who long imagined themselves to be safe, but now feel attacked, whose work is threatened by robots, technology, but also by cheap foreign workers willing to work for less, and by highly educated people working below their level. And for this squeezed middle class, the escape routes to a better life are becoming scarcer by the day. Their underpasses are blocked one by one. Education is no longer a prerequisite for success, nor is hard work. The job market itself is becoming increasingly unfair. In fact, the middle class is moving from the right to the wrong side of the tracks in the Netherlands. Flexibility threatening the continuity of their work, youth unemployment threatening the future of their children. And like in the States, this plot turn can be measured by levels of despair. While people believe that their opportunities have increased in comparison to the past, they are not so positive about the future. In particular, the lower educated are very, very worried. This graphic shows that lesser educated people feel that their chance of completing higher education has increased in comparison to 30 years ago. But they think their chances will decline in 20 years' time. So far, the underpasses are still accessible. But for how long? Will increased flexibilization and globalization cut off all access points? And what will the future, the age of the robots, bring us? Our task is to ensure access to the underpasses to social advancement, no matter what happens. It's all about the choices we make as a society. If you believe the globalists, opportunity is a self-managing unit that will sort itself out along the way. Everyone will get his fair share, and if you didn't get yours, then you must have done something terribly wrong. This is, of course, a lie. Opportunity is not a self-managing unit, a guaranteed fait accompli. You can compare it to a biology test at elementary school. 2 plant seeds in 2 plant pots filled with earth, one of them placed in the sun and watered every day, and the other one neglected. Which plant will flourish? I don't think you have to be a biologist to answer the question. For the plant left in the dark, there is no opportunity to grow, let alone flourish. Ladies and gentlemen, equal opportunity is a choice, It's not an individual choice, it's a collective choice. First, it's a choice to provide all of our kids with fertile soil. This effort reaches beyond the dinner table. It involves decent housing in mixed neighborhoods, a good education, a network, mentors, the opportunity to mix with kids from other social backgrounds, the opportunity to do extracurricular activities at school, the opportunity to build social capital, in other words. It's a choice against private schools, against early selection, against segregated communities. When I used to be deputy mayor here in Amsterdam, I introduced additional scrutiny for public schools. In my current position, I want to ensure that all children are able to go to kindergarten and benefit from social encounters with other children. Equal opportunity for our kids is also a political choice regarding the redistribution of wealth. It's like shuffling the cards before a poker match. It ensures everyone gets a fair shake, an equal opportunity of winning the game. It's a political choice we have already made and a choice we should continue to make in the Netherlands. Take a look at the graph above. According to a reputable study, inequality in the Netherlands and the US was equally high before taxes in 2005, which is the last year we have reliable data for. Yet after taxes, inequality was much, much lower in the Netherlands. These figures show that equal opportunity really is a political choice. And equal opportunity also means strengthening the core of our society, our middle class. Without it, our welfare state would fall in two, leaving us with a divided society. And equal opportunity is about looking at the future. We need to improve and personalize education. We need to ensure everyone is able to cope in the age of the robots. We need to normalize work-to-work transitions instead of falling to unemployment. We need to encourage lifelong learning to enable people to move to growth sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, equal opportunity is not an easy choice. It means swimming against the tide. Too many people are blindly following the Pied Piper of neoliberal economists who are promising us more jobs as long as we keep income in terms of unemployment as low and as sober as possible. They fail to understand that if we do just that, the value of work itself will be bartered away in the marketplace. And with it, the chances for opportunity. It forces people to take on 4 jobs in order to make ends meet, let alone earn a living wage. Do you think these people will have time to feed their kids with opportunity? I sincerely doubt it. Far too busy extinguishing fires. Ladies and gentlemen, in our country there is still opportunity for everyone. Yet, our welfare state is not a title for life, it's a floating trophy that needs to be won every year. Only then can we guarantee social mobility. And while the Dutch story of wealth and opportunity is much less gloomy than that of the US today, we do need to copy-paste Putnam's advice to secure the future of our kids. Kids left in the dark will not flourish, let alone grow. We need to feed them with opportunity. We need to prevent the social divide from increasing by strengthening our middle class. And we need to anticipate current and future challenges. In short, we need to prevent a similar scenario to that in the United States. Opportunity should remain a luxury everyone can afford. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to invite Professor Robert Putnam to take the stage.
I have a very loud voice. Oh, there it is. Thank you very much for coming. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you. And I'm delighted to have been introduced by the minister with that very interesting account of life and social life in the Netherlands. During the discussion that follows my remarks, we'll have a chance to compare and contrast the Netherlands and the United States. And I'm looking forward to that conversation. But I'm going to begin by not talking about the Netherlands, because I want to start with what I know about which is the United States. And I want to talk, if I can, pretty briefly and briskly about what's been happening in my country over the last 50 years. Many good things have happened. There's less racism in America than there was 50 years ago. Still racism, but less than there was 50 years ago. There's much greater equality for my daughter than there was for women a generation ago. Much improved equality in gender terms. Not perfect, but the trends are in the right direction. We also have niftier telephones than we did when I was growing up 50 years ago. So there are many good things, but I want to focus tonight on one big thing that's gotten much worse over the last 50 years in America. And so I want to begin very quickly with a view of American social change over the last 50 years from the level of 30,000 feet or of 10,000 meters, and then I want to zoom down closer to real life in American towns and cities. Could we have the next slide, please? Very quickly, since the 1970s, as is widely known, there's been a growing income disparity in America. Rich Americans, this is going to be the rich end of the room tonight, rich Americans have gotten, that's not a personal comment, rich Americans have gotten much richer over the last 30 or 40 years, but Americans from about the middle down to the poor end of the room, I'm sorry, this is the poor end of the room, have not had a raise in the last 30 years. So there's a growing income gap. More important and less widely known, there is growing social class segregation in America. America is not more segregated in all respects. We're less segregated in racial terms than we used to be. We're less segregated in religious terms than we used to be. But we're more segregated in social class terms. More and more of us are living either in rich enclaves with other rich families, and our kids, our affluent kids, are going to school and connecting with other rich kids, or if we're less lucky, we're less educated and less affluent, we're living more and more in poor communities. And fewer of us are living in middle or mixed or moderate income neighborhoods. It's not just in terms of where we live, it's also in terms of who we go to school with. Increasingly, rich kids go to school with rich kids, and poor kids go to school with poor kids, and as a consequence, the schools themselves have become quite different. We're even less likely to marry people of a different social class than we were. We're more likely to marry people across racial lines, much more likely to marry people now across religious lines than we used to, but less likely to marry people across social class lines. That's important sociologically because it turns out that intermarriage rates are a nice indicator of the degree to which society is well integrated. Fundamentally, the crucial point here is that we tend not to marry people that we don't know. I'm sorry, that was a joke. Don't Dutch people do jokes? We tend not to marry people that we don't know, and therefore, if the intermarriage rate across some line, across racial lines is going up, what that reflects is kids in their marriageable years are more likely to encounter people of different races or different religions, and therefore, and sometimes sparks fly and they form a couple. And conversely, this is the point I want to make, if intermarriage across class lines is going down, what that means is that in fact people in their 20s and 30s and teens are less likely than they used to even meet people of a different social class. That's why the intermarriage rate is so important as a symbol or as a sign of what's happening in America. And finally, there's been a really rather catastrophic collapse of what I call social capital, social connections, in what we used to call the working class. And I'm going to be showing you a little bit later, quickly, some slides, some charts that show you how life is changing for kids. Could we have the next slide? Because this book is about what are the implications for the next generation. Sorry, back up, please. One, don't go too quickly. What are the implications for the next generation of all those changes? Do you understand the structure? I mean, those are the big changes, and the question is, how does that affect kids? But rather than beginning with numbers, I'm going to begin with a story. I'm going to begin with a story about us. Now you can go to the next slide. A story about a small town in the middle of America. It's a little town of about 5,000 people. It was about 5,000 people 50 years ago. It's a town on the Great Lakes, on Lake Erie, in the state of Ohio, right in the middle of America. It's a town I know rather well because it's where I grew up. It's my hometown. And I graduated from high school in 1959. That means I'm very old. And it means I have a perspective on the history of this little town. When I was growing up, Port Clinton was a kind of a modest little middle-class, middle-life, undistinguished town. No very rich people, no very poor people. The dads of my classmates worked on assembly lines, factory workers in small factories in town, or they were fishermen on Lake Erie, or they worked in the local gypsum mines, or like my dad, they were small businessmen. And social class did not seem a big part of our lives. Now it's more than 50 years later, and we're all in our 70s, and you can ask, well, how did we do, my classmates and I? And the answer is, we did amazingly well. Not because we were smart, but in fact, 80% of us did better than our parents in educational and income terms. And the kids from the wrong side of the tracks, poor kids, have done just about as well 50 years later as kids from the right side of the tracks. It's the American dream for that group of people, not because we were special, but just because we were living in a place and time in which the American dream that everybody should be able to do as well as they can based on their own talents and their own hard work, but that it shouldn't depend on what their parents did. The American dream was accurate there. I got a fellowship from a local company. I went off to college. I met a really smart, cute young co-ed. She's sitting right there. Actually, we've been hanging out together for the last 55 years. So far, so good. We had two wonderful children. They both went to Harvard. They in turn got married, and we have a total of 7 grandchildren. I want to show you the pictures of my 7 grandchildren. Our oldest granddaughter is Miriam. Miriam is just in her last year of college now. She's majoring in French literature. She's at an excellent, one of the best colleges in America. She's studying French literature. She spent last summer in Paris studying, or at least this is what she told us, studying French literature and French cuisine, and she's great. And that represents the opportunities available to kids coming from the upper part of American society. But when I say upper part, I don't mean just Bill Gates' kids. I mean people who are coming from homes where the parents had graduated from college. That's the upper third of American society. Now, meanwhile, back in Port Clinton, after I graduated, there was a guy in town his name is not Joe, that's a pseudonym, but he was a very real person. Joe decided, unlike me, he decided not to go to college. He got a good job in a local factory, and for most of his life, he had a very successful life, both economically and socially. He had 2 kids. Both of his kids graduated from Port Clinton High School, and then the bottom fell out of the working class economy in America and in Port Clinton. All the factories that had been around town, if you go to Port Clinton now, they're all physically there, but as ruins, surrounded by barbed wire fences and warnings about environmental pollution. Joe's kids, when they graduated from high school, thought that they would follow their dad into one of those factories, but actually, they have never held a steady job. They've never gotten married. But that has not stopped them from having children. And one of Joe's grandchildren is named Mary Sue. She's exactly the same age as my Miriam. And I want to now, if you'll allow me, just read to you the notes that one of my colleagues on the research team, a woman named Jen Silva, the notes she took from her interview with Mary Sue. Remember, Mary Sue is also, Miriam is a granddaughter of Port Clinton, Mary Sue is a granddaughter of Port Clinton, just about the same age. Mary Sue tells a harrowing tale of loneliness, distrust, and isolation. Her parents split up when she was 5, and her mother turned to stripping and left Mary Sue alone and hungry for days. Her dad hooked up with another woman who hit Mary Sue, refused to feed her, and confined her to a room with baby gates. Caught trafficking marijuana at 16, Mary Sue herself spent several months in a juvenile detention center, failed out of high school, and got a diploma, in quotation marks, a diploma online. Her experiences have left her with a deep-seated mistrust of anyone and everyone, embodied in the scars on her arms, which we saw, left from the burns that she got from a man she spent time with several nights before. Mary Sue wistfully recalls her stillborn baby, born when Mary Sue was 13. Since breaking up with that baby's dad, who left her for someone else, and with a second fiancé, who cheated on her after his release from prison, Mary Sue is currently dating an older man who has 2 infants, born 2 months apart, to 2 other women. And to Mary Sue, this feels like the best she can hope for. Actually, the story of Mary Sue is even more tragic. We keep up with Mary Sue. My team keeps up with Mary Sue. She learned that her new friend, this older man that she's with, has told her he can get her a job working as a model in a nearby town, Toledo, Ohio. The story is even worse. Mary Sue posted on Facebook just a few months ago. She's figured out her problem. Her problem, she says, is that no one in the world loves her. That's probably true. And her solution to that, she's going to have a baby, because at least the baby will love her. If you think Mary Sue's in a tough bind, how about Mary Sue's baby? The contrast between my Miriam spending the summer in Paris and Mary Sue barely surviving is almost too painful to describe. These are 2 women exactly the same age, granddaughters of the same town, but they live in different universes. And they're pointed toward completely different futures. I'm really proud of Miriam, my granddaughter. She works hard. She's done really good things in her life. She made one really good decision, it turns out. She chose college-educated parents. In an era in which having a college degree meant a lot. And from that, a lot of good things have happened to Miriam because of that choice. Mary Sue has made only one mistake. She chose high school-educated parents in an era in which people with high school degrees were not doing so well, economically and socially. That story captures what's been happening to America. There's a little bit more about Port Clinton I have to tell you. Port Clinton, the main part of Port Clinton is actually is kind of a depressed area. But Port Clinton has a wonderful site, a location right on Lake Erie. It's a beautiful site. When I was growing up, it was mostly orchards and fishing camps. But that beautiful site now, if you go to Port Clinton with me, is one long gated community, 20 miles long and 150 meters deep, of million-dollar mansions. If you have the next slide, I just want to show you a map of Port Clinton quickly. This is the map of child poverty in Port Clinton. Remember, Port Clinton is, I'm not talking here about New York or Harlem or Los Angeles. I'm talking about a tiny little town. Could be a town in someplace in the countryside in this country. That's the child poverty rate in Port Clinton in 1990, just after the factories had started closing. The child poverty rate in the center part of Port Clinton was about 7%. The child poverty rate in the rest of Port Clinton was about 1%. Now I'm going to fast forward. Don't move yet. I'm going to fast forward. I'm going to ask you to keep your eyes out here on this peninsula pointing up. It's called Catawba Island, but that's where the $1 million mansions are, and the golf courses and the yacht clubs and so on. And we're going to show you the same graph, but now 25 years later. Can we have the next slide? That's child poverty in Port Clinton today. Child poverty out there on the shore is 0. If you drive down this road right here along the coast there, and you look to the left toward Lake Erie, the number of poor children in that census tract is 0. Well, of course, they're all $1 million mansions. How they're going to be poor kids. But if you look to the other side of the road, where they have these dilapidated trailers and shacks where Mary Sue lives, the child poverty rate is 50%. And that captures this extreme segregation that I was talking about before. Now, you're going to say, come on, Putnam, who cares about your hometown? What is too bad about your hometown? But I wouldn't have told you this story if it weren't the case that Port Clinton is perfectly typical of what's happened in America. And now, very quickly, I'm going to show you some numbers and charts and graphs that are going to reveal the fact that I am not just telling you a heart-rending story about my hometown. What I've been telling you is about what's happening across America. Firstly, the next slide. We can have the next slide, please. This shows all the places where we've done similar kinds of studies. We've done this similar kind of study in Orange County, California, and Austin, Texas, one of the great high-tech places in America, and Atlanta, Georgia, and Bend, Oregon, and Philadelphia, and Boston, and Duluth, Minnesota, and there are Mary Sues everywhere in America. I want to show you some pictures that show the trends over time in some measures of how kids are doing. Now, I know some people are data people. They like numbers and charts and graphs. If you like numbers and charts and graphs, you're going to love the next 10 minutes here. If you don't, just close your eyes and relax and trust me, because I'm going to tell you what the graphs show. And I know that you will, because I know that the Netherlands is a high-trust society, so I'm quite confident. Can we have the next slide? Let's skip this one. Let's go to the next slide. There are different ways in which parents can invest in their children. Parents can invest money in their children or time in their children. And on this graph, we show trends in the amount of money that parents from different social classes spend for what's called enrichment. That's spending on piano lessons, or summer camp, or special ice skating shoes, or trips to Paris. And you can see that the amount of money being spent on those things by rich parents has gone up dramatically, whereas the amount of money that poor parents have spent on those sorts of things has not gone up at all. And so one way to look at that graph on the right-hand side is to think of that as the piano lesson gap or the summer camp gap. But even more important than that is actually the graph on the other side, which is the amount of time parents spend helping their kids when they're little, just talking to them and interacting with them. Basically, all time that parents spend with kids can be divided into two categories: physical sustenance, which we call diaper time. Do you know what a diaper? Yeah, okay. And what we call Good Night Moon time, after the most famous children's book in America, called Good Night Moon. And it turns out there are no class differences in diaper time. It takes just as long to change a rich diaper as a poor diaper. And there have been no changes over time in diaper time. We're spending just as much time on physical care for kids as we used to, but there have been dramatic changes in the amount of time that we spend interacting with our kids, in reading to them and so on. It's gone up for both rich families and poor families, but it's gone up so much more rapidly that among the Miriams of the world, Miriam is my granddaughter, the Miriams of the world now are getting 40 minutes every day more time their parents interacting with them. And if you think that's trivial, that's because you don't know the most recent brain science. What recent brain science has taught us is the human brain, the infant brain, does not develop like a mushroom in a dark room all by itself growing. No, the human brain grows through social interaction. It's what the scientists call serve and response. The baby issues some signal like, ooh, and some nearby adult says, oh, isn't that sweet? And then the baby issues another signal like, ooh, 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 and the adult says, oh, looks just like my mother. Do you see what I mean by serve and response? That social interaction is how our brains are biologically programmed to develop, and therefore my Miriam and all of the other upper-class kids are getting 40 minutes a day more of that developmental integration, developmental encouragement, that time with mom and dad that has real benefits. I don't mean this is not just, wouldn't it be nice if we could spend time with our kids? Kids' IQ is greater if they have more time with mom and dad reading them and so on. So those are graphs. Now do you see what I mean by a scissors graph? And I'm going to show you a lot of other scissors graphs, but quickly, the scissors are, things are getting better for upper-class kids and getting worse for poor kids. My message is not that there's a class gap in America. There's always been a class gap in America. My argument is, in the last 30 or 40 years, it's gotten a lot worse. And that's what's wrong with this. That's the underlying problem. We'll do some more scissors graphs just quickly. We have the next slide, please. This is trends in family dinners. This is what the minister was talking about. Family dinners, well, they had been going down for both rich families and poor families, but then beginning around 1990, families that were affluent stopped declining in the amount of time that they were having family dinners. By the way, do you know what I mean by a family dinner? I don't mean Thanksgiving or Christmas. I mean just sitting down, mom, dad, and the kids, and you can see there's the growing gap. And if you think that's just trivial, that's because you don't know that the evidence shows that having dinner with your kids actually will increase their lifetime income. I mean, it'll help them in lots of other ways, but we Americans count everything by the dollar, so I'm trying to focus here on the things that matter. What I'm trying to say is, it's not trivial that Mary Sue is not getting any time with mom and dad, and that my Miriam got a lot of reading. Her parents read to her, and her grandmother read to her. Occasionally, even I read to her, and that kind of, and also talk over dinner. How was your day? Asking how was your day is one of the most important things that a parent can do. And when you talk to poor moms, as we did in this project, it's not like they don't know that it would be nice to have family dinners, but as one of the women in the book that is one of my favorite characters, she's a single black mom trying hard, working really hard to try to get enough money together to buy a better house for her family in Atlanta, Georgia. She said, honey, we ain't got time for any of that how was your day stuff. And I understand that. She's making the right decision. She's working hard to help her kids. But all that how's your day stuff is one reason why her kids are falling behind. They didn't get that how was your day stuff. Over here we have trends in extracurricular activities, band, chorus, French club, football. And again, you can see the same graph, and if you think, well, who cares about Putnam, are you trying to tell me that the future of America depends upon American high school football? That's hard to believe, isn't it? Well, the fact of the matter is, the evidence shows that taking part in extracurricular activities of all sorts, even football, does in fact teach kids soft skills, and employers are willing to pay for soft skills, and so taking part in these extracurricular activities actually does affect not only your long-run health, but even your long-run income. And if you ask, well, why is it suddenly it used to be when I was growing up that all the kids in town just for being kids, got free opportunities to take part in sports. But what's happened over the last 25 years in America is that increasingly, if you want to play you want to play trombone in the band, or you want to play basketball or something at school, your parents have to pay, on average, $800 per child per year, or if you've got two kids in high school, $1,600. Now, if your annual income is $200,000, $1,600 is trivial. But if your annual income is $16,000, who in their right mind is going to pay a tenth of their total family annual income for sports? And the answer is they're not. And I think actually that's evil. I mean, it should just be as it was for most of the 20th century. The good taxpayers of Port Clinton, I was a lousy football player, but they paid for my pads and my shoes and my helmet and the coach. They paid for a trombone for me, and for 4 years of trombone lessons. I was lousy at it. And they paid for the music and the lights, and they did that. They did that for all the kids in town because it was one of the things we did for kids, to give them a chance to develop soft skills. And now we say, no, that's a frill. If you want that, your parents have to pay for it. But of course, what that means inevitably is rich parents pay for it, poor parents don't. Next slide, please. I could keep going on here. There's trends in church attendance, which shows, by the way, another growing gap. The reason I talk about church attendance is not theological. It's not that I'm worried that these kids are on the wrong side of God. It's that in America, at least, churches used to be a place where some adults outside the family were paying attention to other people's kids. And these kids are now, and not only for churches, but all sorts of other community organizations, left alone. Indeed, the single most general point you can make about poor kids in America today is they are alone. They can't trust their parents because their families are in disarray. They can't trust the schools because they're going to poor schools. They can't trust the churches because they're not in church. They can't trust anybody. And they know it. The right-hand side shows trends in social trust. But I'm not just trying to talk about trust, airy-fairy, wouldn't this be nice if. I want to try to convey to you why this matters to kids. I begin with the premise that all kids do dumb things. Rich kids, poor kids, black kids, white kids, brown kids, American kids, maybe even a few Dutch kids do dumb things. If you're a kid and you do a dumb thing and you come from an affluent family, you start get involved in drugs, or you drink too much, or I get in a fight with a teacher or something. You do some dumb thing. Instantly, if you're from an affluent family, airbags inflate to protect you from the worst consequences of that and allow you to learn from your mistake. If Miriam, God forbid, if I discovered that Miriam was into drugs, the first thing I'd do is hire a good lawyer, and the second thing I'd do is look around for the best rehabilitation facility. But if Mary Sue did exactly the same thing, or any poor kid in America did exactly the same thing, no airbags. That's I'm trying to give you a feeling of what it means that we have increasingly left our working class kids isolated and alone. Next slide, please. This is the last slide, and I know it's a little tiring. It's late, and who told you were going to have to watch slides? But I want you to look at the slide just for a minute, because it shows the likelihood that you will complete college depending upon two things: how smart you are, as measured by your mathematics test scores in the 8th grade. When you're about 14, how good are you at mathematics? And simultaneously, how rich your parents are. And you're not surprised that over here, you shouldn't be very surprised, these are smart, rich kids. And of smart, rich kids in America, 74% complete college. Over there are not so smart, poor kids, and 3% of them finish college. But here's what I want you to look at. These are smart, poor kids. And 29% of them in America now finish college. And these are challenged, rich kids. And 30% of them finish college. And that's directly contrary to the American dream. It's directly contrary to the equal opportunity. And what it means is, one way to look at it is, this is a huge cost to America. 71% of our brightest poor kids are not going to contribute to our economy because they're not getting. That's dumb. And what it means is this, and I'm now trying to pull this all to this part of the talk to a conclusion. It's not just the problem of Mary Sue and Miriam is not just that it seems morally wrong that one of these kids should have such a different opportunity set, but it's costing America. I mean, economically costing America. It's not smart to not invest in poor kids. If we have the next slide, I'm going to be really, really quick here because I've gone over time. In fact, this is a quick summary of why all of this has happened. Part of it is the collapse of the working class family, because now in America, of all kids born to mothers who have a high school degree or less, in America, 70% of those kids are living with only one parent. 70%. Whereas the same number for college-educated Americans is about 7%. And it didn't used to be that way. Now, I want to make clear, I'm talking about family stability. I'm not blaming the moms. If I'm blaming anybody, it's the dads. And I'm not morally offended by that. What I'm offended by is that it just turns out it's easier to raise kids. This is what the sociology makes this very clear, and those of us who are on the left politically shouldn't hide from this fact. It actually is easier to raise kids if there are two parents at home than if they're not. And increasingly, the collapse of the working class family, it's not about race, it's about social class, is part of the story. Part of the story, next slide, part of the story is economic insecurity among poor folks. I just pause for just a second here. Did you all know that I was a Harvard professor before you came here? And you probably assumed it's not easy to be a Harvard professor. That's true. You have to pass a lot of tests to be a Harvard professor. One of the most important, in fact, the most important test you have to pass to be a Harvard professor is a test in name dropping. And I'm now about to convince you that I'm a legitimate Harvard professor. So not long ago, I was at the White House talking with the president and his wife about this opportunity gap. Did that work? Actually, that's true for the current president, but it was also true for his predecessor. Because a couple of years ago, I went to the White House and talked to George W. Bush about the gap, and he was very concerned about it. Interestingly, he was very concerned about it, even though he's on the right politically. Why? Because if what I was telling him about the scissors gaps was true, I was telling the leader of America that the basis of legitimacy in America was under threat, and no president, conservative or liberal, could just walk away from that. That's a big deal in America. So he's a smart guy. He started asking me how much of this is due to family structure, and I said maybe 30% of it is that. He said, what else is going on? And I was trying to think how to tell the guy who had just cut taxes on rich folks and cut programs for poor folks that it had to do with economic was part of the story, but I wanted to be polite. I was a guest there, actually, at the White House, obviously. So I was stumbling around, and his wife, Laura Bush, interrupted me, and she turned to her husband and said, George, just think about it. If you don't know how long you're going to keep your job, and you don't know how long you're going to keep your house, you just have less energy to invest in the kids. Bingo. She's right. In my research group, we call that the Laura Bush hypothesis. And that's an important part of the story. There are other parts of the story. Do flip quickly through the next couple of slides. Next slide. Next slide. The fundamental reason, however, is this. When I was growing up in Port Clinton in the 1950s, and my parents said, we've got to do things for our kids here. We need to do things for our kids so they have a swimming pool. They were not talking about building a pool for my sister and me in our backyard. They were talking about paying higher taxes so that all the kids in town could have a swimming pool. The word "our kids" meant all the kids. But over the course of the last 30 or 40 years in America, the meaning of "our kids" has narrowed and shriveled so that now when people talk about doing things for our kids, they mean for their biological kids. And in Port Clinton, if you ask people about Mary Sue, they say, well, she's not my child. Let somebody else worry about her. She's somebody else's child. That cultural difference is why the book is called Our Kids and what I think is fundamentally going wrong here. Now, if we had more time, I'd talk more about what we could do to fix this problem. And we could talk about whether any of these trends are true in the Netherlands. And I was encouraged to hear from the minister that doesn't look like certainly the Netherlands is doing better than America. There wasn't any doubt about that. I guess the underlying question, though, is whether that will continue to be true of the Netherlands going forward. And here's the test I want you to think about for a minute. Think of, I don't know whether there's increasing segregation in Amsterdam, class segregation in Amsterdam, but would somebody give me the name of a neighborhood where lots of poor immigrant kids live? Just, what's the name of a? Belmer, okay. So here's the test. If you drive by the neighborhood of Belmer, or you read about it in the newspaper, and talk about and see the kids there that are in trouble and not doing well, do you think of the Belmar kids as our kids or as their kids? If you think of them as our kids, then you're not going to face this problem. But if you think of them as their kids, somebody else's kids, not my kids, then you too are beginning to feel this shrinking sense of we, the sense of who are we really trying to help? So I'm actually, now this is going to sound a little silly, I'm actually pretty optimistic, actually. It's been a downer of a lecture, and I've run out of time. It's been a real downer of a lecture, and I've run out of time, but actually I'm optimistic, and I want to say, just take one more minute to tell you why I'm optimistic. This is not the first time that America has faced this problem. We have previously been in a situation of great income inequality, of great social class segregation, of great immigration, of intense political corruption, of intense selfishness. The last time we did that was around the turn of the last century, the so-called Gilded Age, around 1900. A lot of similarities between that period and now. And then in a remarkably short period of time, we turned the corner. And in about 10 or 15 years, Americans, first of all, began to recognize that these are all our kids. Even though they look different from us because they're Italian kids, or they're immigrants, they're children of Italian immigrants, or children of Jewish immigrants, or whatever. This is what I'm talking about then, not now. Or they're just poor. They're our kids too. And we did a lot of reforms. I want to just mention the most important single reform. In that period, in 1910, in small towns beginning in the middle of America, not in Washington, D.C., and not in New York City, and not in California, but in small little towns in the middle of America, American people invented the high school. For the first time in human history, communities said, every kid in town here, just by virtue of being a kid, is going to get 4 years of free secondary education. That was before anybody in Europe had been doing that. And it was debated. It was politically controversial because the rich folks in town said, "Wait a minute, we've already paid for our kids to go to, get a private education. When now you want us to pay for somebody else's kids?" But they were persuaded, and it turned out to be the best single decision America has ever made. I mean that seriously, the best decision we've ever made, because two things simultaneously. It raised the whole economic growth rate of all of America so much that decision to have free secondary education for everybody, poor kids included, raised the average growth rate of America so much that it accounts for almost all of American economic growth in the whole 20th century. So it was good for everybody, and it also leveled the playing field. Economists will tell you there's not many times you can both help everybody and especially help poor kids, and that's what that program was. Now, I don't know what the 21st century equivalent is of the high school. I've got some ideas, and maybe in the question and answer we can talk about that. But what I want to say to Americans, I'm not talking to Dutch people now, these are our kids. Our future is bound up with Mary Sue. My Miriam is going to live a worse life if we ignore Mary Sue. And I'm not saying that we have to, because we've been here and done this in the past, I'm not saying we should somehow become Denmark. I'm saying we should just become America again. We've done this before. And I think there's a decent chance that we may. But it's going to require a lot of organizing and a little passion. Thanks very much for your time.
Wow. Thank you very much, Mr. Putnam. First question, I've thought long and hard of what I wanted to ask you, and the first thing actually that springs to my mind is this is such a powerful story. How can this disparity between these two classes have grown basically unnoticed, that you now have to give these fervent lectures in order to convince the people that it's actually so?
Can I briefly go back to that earlier period, in 1890, when America was divided and living and was socioeconomically segregated. I don't mean legally segregated, I mean de facto segregated. a Danish-American journalist wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. And it was just a description with pictures of the tenements and slums and squalor and poverty on the Lower East Side of New York. The book meant to be read by wealthy folks on the Upper East Side of New York. And effectively, the book, How the Other Half Lives, was designed to say, do you know what life is like in America? Right here, look. And some of the rich folks said, sure, why not? That's fine, it's their fault, let them worry about it. But some of the rich folks said, I didn't know that. And they began to join a more progressive coalition. I do say that one of the reasons that we could not have noticed, I didn't know how bad the problem was until I went out and started talking to poor kids. But because the segregation affects all of us, and most educated Americans, whether their heart is in the right place or their heart is in the wrong place, actually don't any longer have the personal connections that would allow them to see that. So part of the reason for the book and the stories, and Mary Sue, is that I'm trying to basically say to almost everybody who reads my book is going to be in the upper part. I'm trying to say to them, look, this is what life is like down at the bottom. Are you happy with that? And some people will say, sure, why not? But I'm betting that enough people will say, no, I'm not happy with that.
Well, you're a researcher, you engage with an academic community.
Sure.
Apparently also they have not been able to pick up this theme. They've also not shown the world, which may be even a task of academics, you could say. They've also not shown the world how the other half lives.
Well, I want to be I don't want to be quite so harsh on my colleagues, because as I say in the book, in the acknowledgments of the book, this is a book in which much of the evidence, the underlying research, is done by other people. I'm not plagiarizing it. I mean, I acknowledge other people. And some of what I showed you are actually all the graphs I showed you are my graphs. But the underlying evidence is known to social scientists in America. This is not unknown to social scientists. If I have any, value added, I can sometimes say things that everybody knows, all academics know, but in a slightly more accessible way. And that's why I'm trying to do this. I'm standing on the shoulders of lots and lots of scholars who actually do recognize the problem.
Have you had, I mean, I'm from the 1980s, I don't know the 50s. Have you had the criticism or the point raised that the period you draw as a counterpoint to America today is a glorified 1950s of happy days and a community which is pretty homogeneous, and that's basically not a sustainable, something you can sustainably achieve in a current globalized America with a completely different economy, a different culture? Are you basically not glorifying the past? I'm sure people must have asked you that.
Sure. I try not to glorify the past. I here spoke very quickly. I did mention the fact that earlier period was a more racist period, and it was and a more sexist period. And in talking about Port Clinton in the 1950s, Port Clinton was certainly there was a very clear glass ceiling that prevented my female classmates from going up the ladder, and there was racism in town, although I have to say that there were 2 black kids in my class, both of whom came from very poor backgrounds. None of their parents had gotten past the 3rd grade. Both of those kids, and they faced racism in town. There was racism. I'm not denying that for a second. In a way, that makes the next part of the sentence more striking. Both of them graduated from high school. Both of them went to college. Both of them graduated from college. Both of them went to graduate school, and both of them got graduate degrees, and both of them had professional careers coming from basically literate homes in one generation. And so the basic point I'm trying to make is the 1950s was not perfect. I thought I had said that, but maybe I said it too quickly here. And in the book I say it at great length. But in one respect, it was better. It was not so class-ridden. And if you believe that somehow there's a fixed amount of discrimination, so if we stop discriminating against women and blacks so much, then we have to discriminate against somebody, so we chose the working class. I don't think that's true, actually. I think we could have the benefits that clearly my daughter and other women and minorities have benefited from, without having as well this growing class gap. So the answer is, would I want to return to the 1950s unchanged? No. But would I like to have the changes we've made and also reverse the class discrimination and the class bias that is really big? Absolutely yes.
Let's move the discussion slightly more to the political level, because
Sure.
I first asked you how this gap has been able to grow so widely. But everybody was there also as a political actor. So
Sure.
they could have voted against the policies that made America so. Have people simply not been able to vote in their own interest? Have they not managed to represent themselves politically in such a way that it's beneficial for their own situation? What has happened there on the political
Well,
level?
some parts of this problem are, as you assume, attributable to political decisions, but many of them aren't. It's not that anybody decided, let's have more single parents for the working class. And it's not that anybody decided, let's have all the rich folks live in one area and all the poor folks live in another area. That wasn't, at least directly, the consequence of public policy decisions. Of course, there were decisions made by governments, actually of both political parties, that led to this problem. And sometimes one of the criticisms of my book, the book has been very well received, so I don't have any complaints. But one of the criticisms is I don't name villains. That's the way the criticism has been framed. I don't name villains. And as a very distinguished political operative in America, actually on the other part of the spectrum from me, a guy named Ralph Reed, who's a far-right religious leader, once told me personally, because I know him personally, he said, Bob, you have to have enemies. You have to have villains. No villains, no progress. Well, that's a certain kind of politics. I don't know if that's the kind of politics you have in the Netherlands or not. It's certainly the kind of politics we have in America, and it's not the only kind of politics. You could have a politics in which you try to persuade other people that they should see the world the way you do, and therefore I've gone out of my way, actually, in this book, and I'm not apologizing for it, to try to appeal to people across the political spectrum. This is what I call a purple problem. It's a problem that has both, we distinguish between red and blue. We get the colors backwards because we're a little, screwed up Americans, but we use red for conservative and blue for progressive. Don't ask me why, but this is a purple problem in the sense that part of the problem you can see most clearly through red conservative lenses. You see the collapse of the working class family. Part of the problem you can see most clearly through blue progressive lenses. And I kind of would like to convince Americans of both political perspectives that this is something that we ought to work on together. Now, maybe that's a little out of date.
Well, you do mention also in your book the effects on political dropout, essentially, of this growing disparity between two Americas.
Yeah.
That it's basically also one of the things which struck me about many of the interviewees in your book. They're saying, well, I don't care about politics. It's beyond me. I don't have the mental bandwidth for it. It's all the same to me.
Yeah. Well, they certainly did not say I don't have the mental bandwidth for
well,
it. First
no,
of all, it's not like they're dumb.
That's what I make of it.
And
yeah,
secondly,
yeah.
they would never use that kind of language. I don't have the mental bandwidth. That's a really upper-class language.
I apologize.
But it is true, I don't mean to be making fun of you, it is true, you're right, that these kids are not very sophisticated politically. Mary Sue is a Republican, and you say, why is she a Republican? Because she's heard someplace that Democrats believe in free love. To her, free love means older men raping her, and therefore she's against free love, and therefore she thinks she must be against the Democrats, even though I think probably most people looking at the policies would say, well, that's not right. So it's true that these kids' politics isn't the most important thing in their life, and it can't be. Mary Sue and all the Mary Sues in America are trying to survive, for goodness sakes. There is another aspect to this, though, that you and I have talked about, and I do want to mention here, and it's perhaps relevant to you. At least this part is perhaps relevant to Europe now. When people tried to understand where the support for the Nazis in 1933 came from, Hannah Arendt and others discovered that it was not from the left and not from the right and not from the working class, not from the middle class, but from the disconnected. The people who were most likely to flock to the demagoguery of that period were the people who were disconnected. And now speaking about America, I don't think we're going to have fascism overnight in America. I don't think that at all. But I do think that the more disconnected Americans we have, the less stable American politics is going forward, and the more vulnerable we would be to a demagogue coming along and saying, let's get rid of all the Muslims, or let's get rid of all the Jews, or whatever. I know all in our minds, all of us are thinking in the back of our minds about the events of Paris, and I don't want to falsely bring them in here, but I do think that probably everybody in the room is thinking both about how we can stop this violence and get control of it, and that's partly a matter of serious action against the terrorists, but it's also avoiding a backlash that goes in the other direction about ordinary law-abiding Muslims. I'm probably stepping right into the middle of a highly controversial, not probably, I am stepping right in the middle of a controversial issue, but the more disconnected people there are in a society, the more kind of instability could lead in very unpleasant directions. I'm worried about that in America, and I'm worried about the politics of these kids. Not that they're dumb, they've got other priorities, but that they might be easily influenced in a crisis.
On the issue now that we're talking about politics, I think this is a good moment, with your permission, to bring the minister also into the debate, because as we are talking about politics...
Not because I was just talking about fascism.
Absolutely not. No, because we're talking about politics. Do we have a handheld mic?
I'm sorry,
for the...
that was a joke.
Now, everybody on stage. Mr. Asscher, let me first ask you a short question, which may have a complicated answer, but I still want to ask it to you. If I hear Mr. Putnam's story, the lives of these kids, it happens in the family, to a large extent. And now the family, and this is something I'd also like to have both your views on, but first the minister maybe, the family is, politically speaking, a very touchy subject. Because you can do schools, you can do neighborhoods, but the family is a difficult sphere in life almost to politically enter. Two questions. Do you also see this importance that Mr. Putnam draws to the family, and how would you think of
Sorry, can I just interrupt for 1 second, because there's a premise here. I do not think the family is by any means the only
not the only one, but it's an important one.
The families exist in a broader social context. So I think families are part of the story, but they're certainly not the main or only part of the story. But go ahead, I don't mean to interrupt you.
There we are.
You didn't interrupt me. I was just, factoring the question. I started with saying I had spent dinner with my family for a reason, because I like that part in the book, but also because it's a choice I made, because it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have dinner with a professor from Harvard, and still, because I'm in a very crazy job, I have to make the hard choice to go home. And I was really enjoying that dinner because the Paris attacks were far away. So I don't think that's such a strange concept, and I don't think it's such a big taboo in Dutch politics to consider the fact that it's important to read to your children. And I actually think that there's an analogy to the United States. A lot of people in the Netherlands nowadays have mini jobs, 0-hour contracts, hyper-flexible jobs, and they are like the lady you quoted, one of your favorite characters. They don't have a lot of how was your day time. And I consider that a problem. And I don't think you should try to repair that with family programs, or there's one Christian politician in the Netherlands who wants to prohibit dating sites, etc., because he thinks that's why families fall apart. But it's about, today was also a day when we discussed the dangers of stress in work. So it means I think we have to try to organize our labor market and our work-life balance in a way that everyone can have good work and a good life, so that people can make their own choices. And I'm sure that regardless of your background, everybody would like to spend some time with their kids. But you need this time in life to do that. So I don't think it's such a taboo-ish subject anymore. There was a time in the 90s when CDA politicians were booed when they were talking about families, but that's a time I look back to with embarrassment, because it was my party not taking the issue seriously at that time.
So how do we get people to spend more time with their kids, having dinners and good night moon time?
Well, I think education is part of it, and the changes in the rest of the lives of these parents, these working class parents. That's I mean, we're talking about exactly the same kinds of policies, and I think that no doubt the Netherlands is further ahead on those sorts of policies than the United States. Is one reason why I'm not very unsurprised that the problems are not as great in the Netherlands, because you already do have more family, I think, somewhat more family-friendly policies than we do, and so I think. I mean, actually, I happen to think we're both in agreement that there are things that governments can do. Governments can't say you can't have a baby without a license. That's not what we're talking about. But I think governments can provide supports for families that enable them, A, to stick together, and B, to invest more time and energy in their kids.
And if you see the statistics the minister had in his talk, and then I'm going to also reverse the question, are there points on that where you're saying, well, this is a situation which the Netherlands stands at now, which was basically the United States in the 1990s.
Right.
If I see Port Clinton, I thought that was a very moving graph. Port Clinton in 1990 and now, we are now at Port Clinton 1990 levels when it comes to child poverty, about 1 in 10. So is that something of which you say that is something you have to really keep an eye on, because that's something that might grow further? And I think if you...
Yeah, I want to be really careful here because, as everyone in this room knows, I'm not a specialist on the Netherlands. It is true that my book is not about comparing America to someplace else. My book is about comparing America in 2015 to America in 1980 or 1950. It's changed over time. And I think the most relevant information about Holland would be, the Netherlands would be, not America, Holland, but Netherlands, but the Netherlands now, or the Netherlands in 2020 versus the Netherlands in 1980. And I don't know what that graph would show. I mean, you don't have the same degree of inequality or even the same trend toward income inequality, though you do have the same trend toward wealth inequality, which is not irrelevant in this context. I am told that by people that I think would know that there are some signs of growing social segregation in Dutch society, and that would be a warning sign for me. Can I say just one more thing, and then I want to hear what the minister has to say. The nature of this problem is that there are long lag times built in. It's like global warming. Global warming was started basically by the internal combustion engine, invented in 1890, and then it took another 20 or 30 years before that invention led to lots of cars, and another 20 or 30 years before all those cars began filling the atmosphere with carbon gases, and then another 20 or 30 years before those gases began to actually warm the atmosphere, and then another 20 or 30 years before the glaciers began to melt and the water here in the Netherlands grows. So it was basically a century, and if you wait until the water is on the shores here or going over the dikes, it's too late. And this is just like that. It's going to, between when this problem started in America and when Mary Sue is herself an adult, I mean, is 40 years old, it's going to be 30 or 40 years. But if we wait until then, or if you wait until then, it's going to be too late. So I think this is a case like global warming where you ought to begin paying attention. I'm not trying to lecture you, and I apologize. It sounds like I'm lecturing, or I don't mean you or them. But I do think this is an area where, unusually, this is an area with long lag times, and long lag times means pay attention to early warning signs. That's the way I would put it. I don't know whether you would agree or disagree with that.
I absolutely agree. When I gave my introduction, I said there's no reason to sit back and relax and enjoy the fact that we've covered it all in the Netherlands.
Right.
I made a joke that was perfect moment to pass over the mic, but I didn't, because I'm convinced that this is a choice you have to make every time and every year because of those early warning signs. And you see them in the Netherlands. We know they are there. We see the disconnect. We see that people are losing trust. There's less trust in the political system. There's less trust in the press. There's less trust in a high-trust society.
Sure.
And that's a warning sign. But I think what I really like about your lesson, really, your lecture, and I think we have to take it very seriously, is that there are choices to be made.
Right.
And one thing then I'll just shut up because...
No, go ahead.
one thing I learned when I was in local politics in this city
Sure.
is that one of the warning signs is that, of course, the school results of kids in primary schools in areas like the Bijlmer area you just learned about, or Slotervaart and Bos en Lommer, other areas in this city, which are the poor kids area, is that they were dropping and they were on a downward trend. And also the quality of the schools themselves was dropping. And this is not about funding per se,
Right.
because there are no private schools in Amsterdam. Everybody's going to public schools,
Sure.
but still via extra things, but also via the expectation. And I think if you look at those kids as our kids, then it's unacceptable when their results are just explained. And this is what happened. I was sitting in meetings with school boards, and they were very, very apt, very adequate in explaining why the results were so much worse. But they were never talking about what they expected of those kids. And I asked them a question: who would send their own kids to one of the schools you are in the board of? And there was a deadly silence in the room. Seconds ticking away. No one. And we started a program trying to change this and focusing on to expect more from every child. And we've seen incredible results. 40 schools that were officially deemed weak dropping to 4. The biggest growth was in the Bijlmer area and Bos en Lommer, etc., but all schools benefited. So I think, and you know, the time moves on and there are new programs now, etc., etc. But the reason I tell the story is that I think in politics, as in all of our lives, we can make a difference by, you know, trying to do something about warning signs. So I'm very glad that you ended your story on an optimistic note. But I think for the Netherlands, there's no reason at all to just enjoy the fact that we're doing so much better. It's contrary. In the Netherlands, you see a growing trend of people saying, well, why am I paying all these taxes for these lazy poor kids or for these people who don't, you know, get their proper jobs? The discussion on, let's say, the normalness of paying your taxes and being proud about it, that's been very much under threat in the Netherlands. And this also means that we on the left side of the political spectrum have not been successful enough of convincing people that this is about our kids. So yes, I'm very grateful for your warning, and especially for the fact that this is something we can do something about.
Right.
Let me pick up on an important warning sign, which is at the moment in the public debate in the Netherlands, which was also brought to our attention by your colleague, the Minister of Education. You briefly mentioned it. Parents increasingly invest in schooling outside schooling. So they use their resources to give their own kids, not the other kids, this extra leg up in life.
Right.
That seems to be a condition which could lead to a growth in the chances of those two groups of children. Is that something you would indeed consider as a warning sign for the Netherlands?
Yes, but you can tell I'm focused not so much on holding down performance or opportunities from some kids, but lifting up opportunities for other kids. So, look, my wife and I helped Miriam go to France. And I'm not feeling guilty about that. She's going to do really well, and she should do well. What I am concerned about is no one's doing the same thing for Mary Sue. And so I don't, as between policies that would hold down the top part of the graph or policies that would pull up the bottom part of the graph, I'd much prefer, and actually, to be honest, I think it politically much more feasible to think of ways that would pull up the bottom rather than push down the top.
Is that something that appeals to you? That sort of...
Yeah, I think the problem with those programs now is that they're more about teaching to the test instead of just investing in your children. And teaching to the test is a part of early selection in the Netherlands. And I think testing used to be about protecting the poor kids.
Right.
You know, you're not just sent away. No, you have the brain, so you can move on go to high school, go to college. But nowadays there's a danger, I think, that the tests are an early selection mechanism for which the rich kids are prepared much better. So I agree with you that that should never be something to be ashamed of if you invest in your kids in one way or another. But there might be a warning sign in this phenomenon. But
Perfect. Also, with an eye on the time, I would like to bring in the audience. We are running slightly late. I do apologize for this, but we had so much interesting stuff going on. Is there anybody whom I can give the mic, which is standing right in the middle, where the gentleman who has raised his hand there has to walk to, if he wants to ask his question? And may I ask you to briefly keep it short, ask a question, briefly introduce yourselves, and perhaps say who the question is for.
Good evening, my name is Jos van Ommeren. I think in the 60s, 70s, public housing was still in America. Now it's mainly disappeared. In the Netherlands, politicians also want to reduce public housing. About a third of the population lives in public housing, so I don't think that the warning signs are really there, because the real poor always have cheap housing. What do you consider what happened in the United States because of the reduction in public housing?
Well, it's true that publicly owned housing has mostly disappeared in America, but it's not true that support for housing for poor people has disappeared. I don't want to defend that. I'd like to have a lot more of it, but what's changed primarily is that more of the money now is given to poor families in the form of vouchers, which they can then use themselves to find housing, privately owned housing, or even in some cases buy their own houses. I don't think the issue is, strictly speaking, who owns the house, but rather what access do people have to the house, and are poor people aided to get access to good homes. But actually, I honestly think that the issue is not so much the quality of the house. Of course, the housing quality is important, but it's who else lives there. And even when America had lots of publicly owned housing, those publicly owned housing buildings were entirely segregated from the rest of society, and that segregation was itself really an evil thing. So if I had to choose between publicly owned housing that's segregated and privately owned but publicly subsidized housing that was mixed in across different social classes, it would be easy for me to, I would definitely take the second option.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like the floor? Madam. Please, if you maybe can just queue up with, I think we can take another 3 questions, and then really in the interest of time we have to wrap up and continue the debate afterwards. So that's the...
Hi, my name is Reinier Steffens, and I'm sorry, but I'm part of the choir which you expressly said in Dutch media that you wouldn't necessarily want to be preaching to. But I'd like to make up for that by spreading your story and convincing those that are not here today. And perhaps you could give me some pointers. And on the same, in the same question, I'd like to ask the minister, who's known for bringing his family sometimes into the conversation by having dinner with them and serving as an example, which I've used myself by stating that if even the minister can be at home with his kids, why can't you?
Right.
While he's busy running, well, at least part of the country. How would you, sir, use your bully pulpit to convey this message?
So I'm slightly lost on what the exact question is.
Well, if I could get some pointers from Mr. Putnam, and I'd like to know what Mr. Asscher would like to do with this story as well.
Would you like to very briefly comment?
I don't think I bring in my family to convince people, but I was trying to be open about the fact that there's only so much work that can be done, and there's other things in life too. On the policy level, I'm trying slowly, and of course against stiff resistance from other parties, etc. But I'm trying to improve our policies that are family friendly. But I feel a bit embarrassed to give pointers on how to convince other people.
But you're an example. By telling people
Yes.
that you have dinner with your family, other people will think, well, if the minister can do it, so can I.
Yeah, but I also feel sometimes a bit embarrassed because I am my own boss to a certain extent, and a lot of people don't have that luxury. I think, yes, there's cultural ground to be broken by giving the right examples. And I'm very happy to tell people that even though I'm a career politician, I still value seeing my family. But we have to realize that there are so many people who work 2 jobs a day, have those mini jobs, and I think we have to change that too. So I think we have to combine the 2 things, and I think that's something we have in common. Actually, even though there's increasing segregation in the Netherlands, social segregation, I think most people want to spend more time with their families. I've read a story about a nurse in Australia who was asking people what they regretted at the end of their life. And it was never, having not worked more. It was always, not having spent more time with your family or with your friends. And this is something that could unify us, also in the Netherlands. You can look at income, education, but I think we all long for, a life of purpose and a time we spend with people that are of importance to us. So I use it in that way, but I think it would be unfair if I would go around telling people you should spend more time with your children if they just don't have that time. So
Let's take the next question very quickly. Please keep it brief and ask a question.
Yes, also in your
No, it's fine.
Also, in your talk, you indicated, actually, my name, by the way, is Meerte Biemans. You indicated that equal opportunity starts basically from birth, and maybe some people would even say from conception.
Yes.
But school and extracurricular activities and other examples you mentioned start way beyond that. And actually, children already start school with unequal opportunities.
Sure.
What do you think you can do to help families and children from a very early age?
I think, actually, I cut that part out of my talk because I would have gone on too long, but I think the number 1 priority that I would have for America is much more high-quality early childhood education, and the earlier the better, and much more support for working families to be able to take time off to care for their kids, especially really early. I completely agree with you that earlier is really important. And actually, I think that what happens in the years 0 to 5 are much more important than what happens in the years 5 to 18, and much more important than what happens when kids get to college. The college issue here, I talked about college at the end because that's in a way the finish line, and we can see the rich kids crossing the finish line in much greater numbers than the poor kids, but it didn't start just 1 minute before the finish line. That, I'm completely agreeing with you, that started much earlier, and it's mostly about trying to begin to equalize the opportunities very early in life.
Thank you. Sir, you have the honor of asking the last question of the evening. I'm really sorry for the gentleman behind you.
Professor Putnam, you made numerous references to the working class. I thought this very interesting because this is a term in Holland which is almost taboo. One doesn't talk about the arbeidersklasse, at least not anymore. And I think if one were to look in the documents that emanate from Minister Asscher's political party, the Labour Party, one would have to go back perhaps 50 years to find any reference to the arbeidersklasse in Holland. And the importance of this is, I think, because economists like David Harvey
So I have to keep you ask a question.
Yeah, I'm coming to the question. See a correlation between the decline in the power of the workers' movement and the growing inequality. Do you not think that the solution to the problem is for the Mary Sues to stand up, recognize that they are part of a working class, organize themselves and to reclaim their future rather than to expect it to be given to them by some elite in the country?
Well, I don't know. I think it's actually a little, I don't mean to be casting aspersions on your own views, but I think it's a little much to expect Mary Sue to save herself. She has been deeply damaged And I don't mean only Mary Sue, deeply damaged. Of course we want to put her in a position to be able to speak for herself. But for me to lecture her and say, stop worrying about, how you're going to support this baby of yours, this new baby that's on the way. Stop worrying about that and spend more nights out organizing workers. That sounds like I just haven't been listening to her. I'm entirely in favor of more organization for working class kids, but I mean, for the working class. It's a term that I use in America, frankly, because it sounds even more a little odd in America, and I'm using it because I'm talking about that, what we used to call the working class. But maybe I misunderstood you, but if you think that the solution is for me or for us to all of us say, we're not going to help you, you help yourself, kid, form a union. I don't know if that sounds like it's...
No, if I can just clarify that...
Sorry, I really have to cut you off, because there's people who want to go back to their families, they have to go home. Let me, before giving Tracy the final words on behalf of the John Adams Institute, ask for a very big round of applause for Robert Putnam and the Minister, please.
Let me just very briefly set the record straight on a couple accounts. An omission of my own, we have another board member with us on the front row, Truus Valkering. Truus. Okay. And for the record, Minister Asscher was indeed invited to dinner, but he told us he couldn't come because he had to have dinner with his family, and he was not being coquettish about it. And finally, another record I'd like to put straight at the very end. Indeed, no one on their deathbed will ever say, oh, if only I'd worked more. But I'd like to bring to memory the unforgettable words of Walter Benjamin on his deathbed when asked, what did you miss? Not enough sex. So that'll keep us all hearty and hale for a long time. Sign up for our newsletter, which has been going around. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and come back soon, December 12th, Garry Kasparov, the Grand Chess Master, who has now made his life's work combating Putin for justice in his home country. January 23rd, John Irving, coming back again to the John Adams Institute. And in the course of this year leading up to the elections in November, we have a very exciting and varied election series. So thank you for joining us, and hope to see you again soon. Come back and bring a friend. Signing.
I
forgot the signing.
Taking you on
I forgot the
for
signing.
dropping references to the working class, you traitors to the working class, you.
I forgot the signing.
I'm sorry. Oh, thank you very much. And I'm honored, seriously honored by your presence. I really appreciate it.
If money did my talking, I couldn't breathe a sigh. My baby's love is one thing, even money can't buy. Is that fine? I want to tell you that's fine. That's divine, 'cause she's mine. Ain't that fine? Model, a bundle of charms, but my baby beastie model, 'cause she's got a pair of arms. Ain't that fine? Don't you know that's fine? Ain't that fine? 'Cause she's mine. Ain't that fine? The high cost of living does not bother me, as long as my baby's love is tax-free. Ain't that fine? I want to tell you that's fine. Ain't that fine? 'cause she's mine. Ain't that fine? If you're feeling low down, just grab your hand, start running. There's Jubilee Judy, gin fizz flow, cocktail shorty, and old Julep Joe. I'm telling you, it's the goniest place in town. If you don't have your rubber, you can take a taxi down.